Alright, I'm going to say this right up front. Heart of Ice is one of the best episodes of Batman the Animated Series. It introduced a new version of Mr. Freeze that gave more purpose and complexity to the character than just the cold gimmick. One of the most interesting things about the character is that the gimmick is taken further to inform Mr. Freeze's personality, making him truly cold-hearted, hence the title Heart of Ice. This by itself doesn't fully round out Mr. Freeze's character, but the writing in this episode is very smart to have something extremely emotional happen in his past that tore away all his emotions to make him cold-hearted. The plot this episode revolves around Mr. Freeze stealing parts to assemble a freeze cannon to exact vengeance upon the head of the Gothcore company, Ferris Boil. Boyle is a pretty ironic last name, isn't it, considering how much Mr. Freeze hates him? Actually, if we really want to get into irony about names, despite how it's pronounced, Victor's last name is spelled fries as in French fries. Anyway, Batman tries to stop Mr. Freeze, and in the first encounter is forced to let him get away when Mr. Freeze accidentally freezes one of his men's legs and abandons him. This whole sequence in particular is very meaningful because it shows how cold Mr. Freeze really is and how he no longer has any compassion to a man begging for help. I also really like that it's clear that Batman was about to go after Freeze in his truck, but stops when he hears the criminal shouting a plea for help. This is how I really like Batman to be portrayed. He's quiet and brooding, but has a heart, and will work his best to save as many lives as possible, even if they are on the wrong side of the law. Within more recent years in the comics, not really right now, but more like early 2000s, mid-2000s, there's been an inclination to focus more on the colder aspects of Batman, and it makes me happy to go back and see Batman act more like this. This scene not only strongly supports both Batman and Mr. Freeze's characterizations, but also ties in with the theme the episode itself is centered around: compassion. This nice contrast between Batman and Mr. Freeze and their actions and how they treat others is probably the most compelling aspect of the episode, and it only develops more as the episode progresses. Anyone that knows my opinions about Batman knows I'm a gigantic Paul Dini fanboy, and if you didn't know, I think my Heart of Hush review makes it pretty clear. In my humble opinion, his characterization of Batman is incredibly consistent, and is very true to both how brooding the character can be, and his humanity. In the commentary for this episode, he touches upon how Alfred mentions that Batman shows a surprising amount of compassion for the henchmen. Paul Dini also said that perhaps Batman wasn't being completely altruistic, as he could also be trying to counteract the freezing for the future, given how carefully Batman always prepares for everything. As much as I appreciate how Paul Dini writes Batman, I think I may enjoy how he writes the villains even more, which also applies to this episode. I'll kiss up to Dini once more for now, to say I think that he's written the best Joker dialogue of all time throughout his body of work. Getting back to the episode, Batman ironically catches a cold after the fight with Mr. Freeze. As Bruce Wayne, he goes to talk to Ferris Boil, who by many is regarded as a person for the people and a humanitarian. After a full scene of conversation with Boyle, both Bruce and the audience can now see Boyle isn't all he's cracked up to be, especially when he says that the People Company as the slogan for Gothcorp is great PR, but when, quote, wage slaves start acting like they own the place, it's time to pull the plug. Ferris Boil is in fact voiced by Mark Hamill himself before he was cast as the voice of the Joker, and he totally sells the part of a businessman who, despite his reputation, is also cold-hearted. Upon learning from Boyle that there was an accident with a scientist, Batman sneaks off to Gothcorp to find files on the accident, but not before Alfred gives him chicken soup, which Alfred says it's, quote, the only way to fight a cold. Actually, I have heard recently that scientifically, chicken soup does absolutely nothing to help a person recover from a cold. But even so, it works well as a storytelling device that I'll come back to later on. Batman is able to get all the information on Victor Freeze, including how his wife was terminally ill, and watches footage of the accident from Freeze's video log. I didn't really notice this before, but after listening to the commentary, I can no longer ignore how unfeasible all the camera angles on the tape are, considering that it was just Victor Freeze's private video log. That's only a nitpick, so I can easily forgive it due to just how powerful this scene is. We get to see the tragedy of how Victor's world was turned upside down, and did something as drastic as taking his emotions and feelings away. It's even more clear how lacking compassion Boyle is when he shows no regard for Freeze's wife Nora, who's barely hanging on to life and purposely kicks Victor into chemicals, and he had already decided not to fire the gun that he had taken from one of the security guards. A scene earlier when Freeze is watching Boyle on TV is given more meaning when he says, "Humanity, compassion, charity. Where were all those pretty words when she needed to hear them?" To be honest, the impact of the scene is slightly lessened due to later episodes because we found out that Freeze didn't actually lose everything as his wife survived the accident. Still, the absolute lack of morale and humanity still makes the tape worthy of Batman's reaction of saying, "My God." When looking at both Freeze and Boyle's actions, it's clear that Freeze has become that who he hates and refers to as a monster. A good touch to the videotape scene is that almost immediately after it's over, Mr. Freeze shows up, and the contrast between how Freeze used to be and now is much more noticeable. Before going to kill Boyle, Freeze and Batman have a brief conversation about how Mr. Freeze will kill anyone in the building just to get to Boyle. While it doesn't make it right, Freeze tells how horrible it is to lose any feeling of warmth, both physical and emotional, and says, "Oh yes, I'd kill for that." Most of the rest of the episode is very cool action sequences, and we reach the climax where Mr. Freeze is about to exact his vengeance on Boyle. Boyle begs for mercy, but Mr. Freeze points out how he has no right to do this when he talks about seeing his wife frozen, begging to him in his nightmare. Mr. Freeze refuses to give any mercy to the same man who refused to give mercy to his wife and destroyed both of their lives. Batman is no match for Mr. Freeze, but uses the chicken soup to crack his helmet and put him out of commission. What makes this defeat interestingly ironic is that Batman defeats him with something that has the thing Freeze now lacks: warmth. Batman then appropriately reiterates what Alfred had told him before with a smile, saying, "The only way to fight a cold." It's a great metaphor for saying that you can overcome coldness and cruelty with warmth, or more accurately, compassion. Batman reminds Mr. Freeze at the end of its importance when he says, after Freeze says, vengeance, that he wanted his vengeance, Batman just says, no. Justice. He executes his justice by turning Freeze over to Arkham Asylum for treatment, but also revealing to the public how cruel Ferris Boil is. I love the line Batman gives him before leaving. "Good night, humanitarian." The very final scene with Mr. Freeze in his cell is truly touching because he now finally shows true emotion that he had said before he was now beyond by shedding tears for the memory of his wife Nora. How well executed the overall message of the importance of being compassionate is truly a testament to the greatness of this episode. Fortunately, the script is not the only place where Heart of Ice is strong. The animation in this episode is just amazing, which makes sense because the same animation studio, Spectrum, animated On the Other Wings, if I remember correctly. The way Batman is drawn is great, and the coloring on his costume is very crisp and vibrant, which is how it looks in the best animated episodes. The action scenes are also a real treat to watch, and there is plenty of fighting here, so the themes are really the glue that holds the episode together. My favorite action sequence is Batman fighting against the goons operating the cannon, because Batman's movements are so lively and has a nice kinetic pace. It's also amazing the consistency Spectrum was able to pull off with Mr. Freeze's helmet, which was airbrushed throughout the entire episode so his helmet looks frosty. The voice acting, as always, is top-notch, which is getting redundant to say. Kevin Conroy did a good job playing a sick Batman, and I like that Batman's cold is played for humor, something else Paul Dini is able to do surprisingly often with a dark character who lives in a generally dark world. Michael Ansara was well cast as the voice of Mr. Freeze, though in this episode he has an electronic filter that he doesn't really have later on, if I recall correctly. Bruce Timm said he really liked the sound quality, though up to recently I wasn't a huge fan of it, probably because my first exposure to Mr. Freeze was from the Sub-Zero movie, where his voice doesn't have as heavy a filter. However, after playing Arkham City, they put a filter on Mr. Freeze's voice that sounds very similar to how it sounds in Heart of Ice. So now I was able to get more the sense that the voice sounds electronic because it's coming from a speaker on the suit. Regarding Michael Ansero's actual performance as the character, he did a great job at sounding cold and emotionless without making it sound boring, which should also be credited to the voice direction of Andrea Romano. Shirley Walker did a great job with the music, which is also part of the course, especially with the musical theme at the beginning and at the end of the episode, though I didn't really notice the music too often throughout. I'm sure we all know this is a great episode, except for those who haven't seen it, which I say to them, go watch it ASAP, especially if you like Batman. Heart of Ice has a very strong script, and wonderfully illustrates the concept of compassion and the lack of it, and the animation is able to match it beat for beat. Especially the scene with the Batmobile where Bruce Timm commented that it's very hard to get a vehicle looking consistent in animation, in cell animation, but it looks very good here. They specifically said that in an episode where it didn't look all that great was Beware the Great Ghost. Anyway, all aspects of the creation of this episode brought its absolute A game, and there's no way I cannot give Heart of Ice a 5 out of 5. It's held by fans as one of the best of the series, and its reputation could not have been earned more. So this is an absolute great episode. Next week, we move on to our second two-parter, which introduces another great character, Catwoman. Stay tuned next week for my review of The Cat and the Claw. See you then. And please, if you have not watched Heart of Ice, do that.